Hello and welcome to the Friday Five. It's October 21st, and we are going to dive into our five key ideas. We're going to talk about a Montessori toy versus a conventional toy. What are the differences? What makes a Montessori toy a Montessori toy? We're going to talk about a practical life idea, when to introduce that, what it might look like at the different ages from birth to 6. We'll talk about a children's book, a recommendation, and then we will talk about a parenting question that I find on the internet this week. If you're joining me live, feel free to use the chat so that I can answer your questions as we go. So let's go to it, the Friday Five. So we're going to talk about the difference in stacking ring toys. So these are going to be primarily for infants and potentially early toddlers. And stacking rings I've got on the right, this would be considered a Montessori toy. And then the one on the left would be considered kind of a non-Montessori toy, but they're essentially trying to do a similar thing. So what's similar about these two items is the recognition that children do really tend to like things that go on top of each other. It's called binary play. When they're in infants, they like to do things that are on top of and then the opposite. So they like to put things in and then take them out. They like to put them on and take them off. They like to put things under and then take them out. So these are both sort of getting to the child's interest at their infancy age. This is probably going to be most interesting to a child who is already sitting, as the child who's not yet sitting is looking up at the world on their back, and it's a lot harder for them to do a kind of activity like this. But one of the things that you might notice is, one, the Montessori toy has fewer items. So even though it has 3 in the picture, you would start with 1. And the dowel itself is short enough to kind of accommodate a fewer number of rings. Whereas a conventional toy, the dowel, that sort of central piece that the rings are going on top of, that's quite long. So if you were to take off all of the rings except for that blue one in the conventional toy, you would have this really long dowel for such a short piece of equipment. But when the child is first using something like this, they don't even know how to put the ring on the dowel. So to give them so many rings to work with, they're probably going to get distracted and never get to the part of putting the ring on the dowel. So to allow the younger child to actually use these materials, we are going to have that dowel short. We're going to give them probably 1 ring, and we can start with a ring that is much wider than the dowel itself. That's going to ease the complexity of this activity. And as the child gets a little bit older, so they're moving from sitting to now they're crawling, that might be a good time to give them a ring that actually fits the dowel. So it's a narrower hole that the child has to do, but still only with 1 ring. And then as they go on, you can try to add more rings. So can you use a conventional stacking rings toy and convert it into using it a Montessori way? Of course, it helps if that dowel is shorter. So if I were looking for a stacking ring toy and I wasn't looking in a place that makes Montessori materials, I would look for a stacking ring toy where the dowel itself is shorter. And then however many rings it comes with, I would take all of them off except for 1, and I would start with that. It tends to be a very popular activity. The child, I think when we often design something like stacking rings, it often is more complex that it could sustain a toddler or an early toddler, but really this activity can be started much earlier as long as we reduce the complexity. And by the time the child is 1.5 or 2, this might be the least interesting toy for them because they're moving out of just binary play and they're moving into other kinds of things that they would really like to do. And this happens a lot with conventional toys, is that they overcomplicate them the young toys so that the young child has a harder time using them. And then it's almost marketed to an older child who would be beyond that stage of play. So that's a little bit about the stacking rings versus what we call discs on a dowel. So it's very Montessori toy names are often very accurate in terms of the language so that we know what we're talking about. And the other thing that there's a whole series in Montessori of different ways that the child can explore the on-off mechanisms of different dowels. What if the dowel was not vertical? What if it's sideways? Can the child still put the ring on? Is that interesting? What if the dowel itself wasn't straight? What if it curved? Right? And could they put the thing on and get it through the wavy bar? So in Montessori, we're always going to be thinking about the child's development, the child's experience, and to try to see when in the child's development would they be doing a certain kind of movement or a certain kind of play, like binary play, and then providing them with the kinds of materials that allow them to play with it, to play with these concepts and ideas. So that's always going to be a foundational principle, is what's going on in the child's development. And then we add things to their environment. So the point of this is not to teach them about discs and dowels and how one fits into the other. That's not the point of any Montessori material. It's not to teach the child something. It's meant to be a benefit to a child who is already working on a concept. So it has to start with the development and then the material support later. So that's the little bit of the difference between the disc on the dowel and the stacking rings. And I would encourage you, as I said, to, if you find or if you have stacking rings, to try to pare it down, see how long that dowel is, see if that's reasonable for the child. And if it's not, if there's a way to produce that game with a shorter dowel for them, and potentially starting with a wider ring and then making it more complicated by narrowing the hole on the inside of the ring, but not actually adding more rings until a little bit later. All right, so that's our Montessori toy and our non-Montessori toy. We're going to hop into practical life. And today we're talking about watering plants. So plant care is going to be something that is going to be a natural, sort of normal part of daily life. So if you have a living being in your home, like a plant or an animal, it's going to need care. Plants in particular, there's some plants that like very little water, and there's some plants that like a lot of water. There's some plants that are used to being indoors and away from the sun, and some plants that really need to be in that window. So part of plant care is sort of recognizing that we need to kind of understand who this living being that we're trying to support before we make a plan of what that support would look like. That can be a really great sort of research for the family if you don't know very much about your plants, that you can include the child in. You can look at the leaf shape to try to identify what this plant is. If you know the name of the plant, you could just look up, does it like sun? Does it like, how much water does it need? Actually figure out the parameters of supporting this plant. You can even, taking a child to a place like a nursery can involve the child in learning about different kinds of plants. This can be something that you do with a toddler, and then the more older they are, the more involved they can be. Certainly starting in preschool, it's going to be a fun exercise for them to maybe have two different plants, one that has very different needs than the other, so that they can learn to pay attention to what the plant looks like, to practice some of their literacy skills, to remind themselves of what the plant needs. Having a planner, a weekly planner, especially with animals, we tend to have to feed them every day, right? So the dog, or if you have a cat or something, you feed them in the morning and you feed them at night, and that tends to be a daily ritual, so you don't have to keep track. But plants, sometimes it's, 10 days. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, and you need to have a system that decides when you're going to plan them. So as the child is older, I would definitely involve them in the planning if there's a way that they can mark off when they plant and water the plants. And if there's a system to know this is what it looks like to water, to take care of this particular plant, if they can manage that and sort of say, okay, well, you watered it here and we're supposed to water it once a week. So it's Sunday again, so we want to make sure that we're watering that plant. So that's sort of the preparation for plant care. We don't want to just have the children water the plants because they often will overwater plants, and that's not good for them. And we want to be able to use this as such a wonderful opportunity to talk to the children about, plant categorization, leaf shapes, the needs of living beings and how they're similar to us and how they might be different. So it's just a really wonderful opportunity to not only learn more about your plants, but also engage the child in starting to think slightly outside themselves, because that's what preschoolers are starting to do. They're starting to look towards their peers. They're starting to move into socially collaborative play. They're starting to look outward from themselves, and to give them an outlet of looking outward through plant care can be a really wonderful experience. So how do we set it up for a child, whether they're younger or once they're trying to manage the care of a plant themselves? What does it look like to support them with this? So there's a couple of things. One is the actual watering mechanism. It doesn't have to be a watering can. A watering can tends to hold a fairly large amount of water. And for houseplants, that large amount of water is probably going to be unnecessary. So I use a little pitcher with a spout, because for a small houseplant, that tends to actually be a really great first amount of water. If my child gets the small pitcher full of water and they give that to the plant, then we can watch and wait, and we have different ways to learn about whether or not the plant has had enough water. So maybe it's 2 pitchers worth, or maybe it's just 1. But the watering can itself, even a child-sized one, just holds a tremendous amount of water. The other thing with watering cans that you find for kids is, if some of them might look really cute and they might look great, and you might say, oh, this is so great, it looks this way, or it's just like what I wanted. You've seen it online. I would pay attention to the practicality of the watering can itself, because there is a logistical consideration of where the handle is. So in this illustration, you'll see the child's watering can, the handle is on the side. So if you imagine a child who is going to have to get water to put into this watering can, they would need to have the top of the watering can free and clear, like it's pictured in this illustration. Because if the opening to the watering can is available, then you just pour water in, no problem. But a lot of watering cans for children, they arch the handle over the top. And if you have a watering can, if you've seen any for kids, you know what I'm talking about. But they arch the handle over the top, which means that as the child is trying to get water into their watering can, there's now a handle blocking the top hole. And so either the water is going to start pouring all over the handle and be very confusing for the child, or they're going to tip the watering can, and again, the water is going to spill, or their hand is going to be right there. And it's going to be way more complicated. The older the child is, the more they're going to be able to navigate that challenge. The younger they are, the more they're going to get tripped up by that. So I would consider, you don't have to get a watering can. If you were to get one, I would look for one where the handle's at the back. Often, watering cans with the handle at the back are going to be larger in volume. So you might consider just getting a pitcher for water. And then the child-sized watering cans just often are arching that handle over the top because it's a smaller vessel. But you don't always need a watering can. That's the take home here. But you would need some kind of vessel that the child can get water in. you would need to think about, how is the child going to get water, right? So do you have a spigot for them to get water outside, or do you want them to get it from the sink? And if they did get water from the spigot, do they know how to turn it on and then which direction to turn it off? Or is the spigot, is there a hose attached to the spigot where at the end of the hose there's a nozzle that they pull on, fill their watering can, and then as soon as they let go, the nozzle has like an automatic shut off. So we have to think through, how is the child going to navigate this? And then we think in the environment, what would it look like to make this pretty simple for my child? The younger they are, the more simple we're going to want to make it. So for a younger child, sometimes people will have a water source that's not the sink. It'll just be a jug that has a spigot, a little nozzle for the water. Sometimes people will just have a larger pitcher that will hold more water. That the idea is the child will take that pitcher and pour a little bit of water into their smaller vessel that they're going to use to water the plant. Or you have some kind of step stool to get to the kitchen sink, and they learn how to do that. But sort of depending on the age of the child, we're going to try to simplify this as much as possible. So figuring out the water vessel, figuring out where the water is going to come from. And then the third element of the water part of watering plants is going to be about cleanup. So what is going to happen if they get their water in their pitcher, and then as they're walking, they're sloshing around and they're spilling water, and they're super proud of themselves and they're getting it over to the plant, but now there's a trail of water. So what are the expectations around, do they know how much to fill it up? Do they fill it to the brim, or is there an expectation that they fill it up halfway? If that's the case, then you need to show them that and show them, model to them, this is how you get water from the pitcher. And you show them and you turn off the water and you say, do you see how much I had in there? Okay, now it's your turn. And you see whether or not they overfill it or if they listen to that halfway mark. And if they listen to the halfway mark, then they're less likely to create a trail of water. But if they did, we need to have some supplies that are for cleaning up water if we want the child to engage with this. So it's harder for these to be an afterthought. It's a lot more helpful if they're in the before thought. So as you show your child, if you were going to invite them to do watering the plants, and you showed them how to fill the pitcher, and you go over and you pour it on the plant's roots, not the leaves, because it's the roots that need the water. Then they put the pitcher back. The last part of that modeling, that demonstration, would be, let's check the floor. And this is often really fun for a toddler. They tend to be very interested in the smallest of things. They like looking for small objects. So as long as we have the equipment, a rag or a towel, however you're going to clean that up, you look for tiny little bits of water and you clean them up, and you put the rag or the towel or whatever you're using into the location it's supposed to be. If it's a paper towel, does it go in the compost? Does it go in the garbage? If it's a rag, does it go to hang up because it was just water and to dry for use next time? Does it go into the laundry? So just thinking through, what are the steps in this process that I expect my child to be able to do? Because if I can't even articulate them, then I'm going to have a really hard time trying to articulate that to my child. So watering plants is going to be that next sort of the actual watering of the plant. So we've got some pre-work. We've got the vessel that we're going to figure out. We're going to make sure the child has access to water, and then that they have the capacity to clean up. So now the plant has been watered. It's very helpful, because children under 6 are sensorial learners. It's very helpful if they have access to something that is going to remind them that this plant has already been watered. Because as I mentioned, animals, we just sort of have to remember the time of day. When you wake up in the morning, we have to feed the dog. When you wake up in the morning, we have to feed the cat, whatever it is. But if it's not a daily experience, we kind of need to keep track. So you can keep track in different ways. One is on a piece of paper. So near the plant, you can have a piece of paper, and they can make a mark or add a sticker on the day that they watered that plant. that can help, because then, if they were like, oh, I want to water today, then you could look at that calendar and you could say, oh, it's only been one day. We need it to be 7 days to water the plant. So you could do it through a calendar. Or you could do it, what often is done in classrooms is a popsicle stick or some other kind of marker, like a marking mechanism, not a writing marker. So something like a popsicle stick can have a little sign on it that says needs water or already watered, right? And so sometimes in the classroom, the little sign will be red for stop, for don't water. And then the little sign will be blue for needs water. And so, especially for the young child, this can be a really helpful thing, is that they learn once they water it, they put the red stick in. And then you can, because especially if you're supporting a toddler, you would be able to then decide, okay, in a week from now, I'm going to pull the red thing and put the blue thing in, and then maybe not even mention it to the child. But if the child sees that, how exciting for them. It's blue. That means I need to water it. So we're helping them pay attention to their environment and pay attention to the needs of the things around them. As we get into preschool, I think that it is helpful for them to sort of do a both and. So the younger they are, using the popsicle system, where you're deciding, but then as they're 4 or 5, they're really starting to do a lot more sequencing and planning. Their executive functions are really starting to take off, and doing work with a calendar is very, very helpful for that, so that they can know, here's a calendar. All the watering days are on Sunday, or they're on every other Sunday. So we're going to sticker those so we know what's happening. And then every day that happens, we're going to cross out that day. And then it's your job to sort of check the calendar and see, is it a watering day? And if it's a watering day, then you get to put out the popsicle stick. And especially if you have 2 children, one who's in preschool and one who's younger in a toddler space, it can be really fun for the older child who might be a little overwatering plants. Some kids love plants and animal care, and sometimes they might kind of feel like, I'm kind of over that. They can prepare it for the younger child. So this is what we do a lot in the classroom, is that the 5-year-olds, they would be the ones that are tracking and figuring out the switch of the popsicle sticks, so that somebody in the classroom would notice it. And so the toddler could notice, and then that's one more thing that's off your plate, and you still know that these plants are getting taken care of. So that would be the last thing, is just having some kind of marker of the plants that you've already cared for. And that is watering plants. There are some extensions on this in Montessori spaces that include dusting the leaves. That's sometimes an extension. There's sometimes actual seed germination. So growing the plant from the beginning is an extension of this. But the core element here is taking care of this one living organism that we have in our house or in our home, and this is what we need to take care of, and involving the child in that. All right, so we're going to move on to our book. So this book is called Come On Rain. It was written by Karen Hesse, and pictures were illustrated by John Muth. It's a really lovely, very poetic story about it being very hot where this child lives, and trying to, really wanting it to rain, and really wanting to splash around in the rain with her friends and neighbors in the puddles. And it's an extremely poetic book. So it's a book that's really has a wonderful cadence to it to read to the child. And it's a really beautiful story. It's also got really beautiful illustrations, and it ties into paying attention to the natural world, paying attention to these little signals that we get about what's going on, which is similar to what we're trying to do with the care of the plants. Is we're trying to help the child as they move from not looking as much inward, they're starting to look outward, is that they also look outward to the natural world. They also think about what is their place in that, in terms of observation and in terms of care. So Come On Rain is a beautiful story, and I find it really lovely to actually read. It's got really beautiful symbolism and really beautiful ways of explaining things. Okay, and we are on to our parenting questions. So this is a question about infants. But this I think would also apply to toddlers. So this family is asking, I'm trying to get food grade paint for my infant. Is there any recommendations? So this is a really interesting question. And I think that there's a couple ways of going about artistic expression for young children. So one of the things I would think about in terms of artistic expression is I would think about it very broadly and not so specific to art materials like crayons or paint. I would think of it really broadly. So artistic expression could be dancing, could be singing. Artistic expression could be moving your body in a different way. It can ultimately be through writing. It can be through dance. It can be all sorts of things. So there's lots of different ways that someone can express themselves artistically. It's a really vital part of the child's sort of holistic well-being that part is honored. That's where there's so much joy in the creative process. And I think that the specific artistic expression through art medium has so much to do with the development of the hand. So, for example, an infant playing with paint is going to be an extremely sensorial experience. They're not creating something that they've thought about and they care about and they're excited about. It's going to be a very sensorial experience with the feeling, the temperature of that process. But it could very well be mud. It doesn't have to be paint. But as the child develops their hand, the hand is such an important part of human development. The brain spends a lot of time developing the hand. And as you see the development of the hand, that's also where you start seeing the hand using itself as a tool to do things that the mind wants it to. And that's where creative expression really shines, is when we have this creative vision, we have this thought, we have this feeling, and it's getting put into practice. And if you think about art medium and art tools, a lot of that is with our hands. Whether it's finger painting or painting with a paintbrush, it has a lot to do with our hands. So I think that it would be helpful for this idea of painting with an infant to really think about that hand timeline, to think about how 6 months is a first sort of big turning point. 6 months is usually around the time when the child has a solid whole hand grasp. They're starting to build that at 3 months, but by 6 months, they've got a solid whole hand grasp. And by 12 months, they've got a pincer grasp. So from 6 to 12 months, they're going from a whole hand to then they're doing thumb opposition and dropping fingers all the way until they get to the pincer grasp. Initially around 12 months, the pincer grasp is inferior. So that's where you see the thumb and forefinger really like connected flat. The proper pincer grasp is when actually the refinement goes all the way down to the tip of the finger. As you see that progression after 12 months, that's when you start seeing the child really take off in terms of their hands doing things. And that's when you start seeing more artistic expression. So you start seeing, the child, particularly after 18 months, is now you see the child starting to actually do things with the art medium that they may have been learning about. Now, before 18 months, the child is going through a lot of teething and they tend to put things in their mouth. Some children stop putting things in their mouth earlier. Some children are hanging on to putting things in their mouth later. But that's going to have a big impact on the art medium that you can use. So that's where this question comes in, is how do I offer this art medium to a child who is still potentially putting a bunch of things in their mouth? Because that wouldn't be, even the water-based non-toxic is probably not ideal that infants are chewing on. So I think that what I would say to this is there's lots of ways to provide sensorial experiences There's lots of ways to provide the opportunity to express yourself through dance and movement and singing younger, that you don't need to do like art media expressive. You don't need to use paint until the child's hand is more developed and they can actually use it for the creative energies that they're trying to. And younger than that, they're likely just getting out of that a real sensorial experience, in which case it might make sense to not really use paint while they're getting fingers in their mouth. You could use food grade paint. Some people do that. But I think we have to be always, as parents, playing the long game. The long game meaning we're not thinking about what needs to happen now. We're thinking about what happens now and then what is that going to do as an impact for the future. So if we want the child, or if we know the child might want to do some kind of painting in the future, and we know in the future, when they're 18 months or 2 years old, that paint is not going to be food grade, then I don't want them to associate to eat this, right? That it's not food. I don't want that literal connection in their brain to be made. So I think that for that reason, I would really shy away from food grade paint. I would say that the child who is still putting things in their mouth, they're not ready for painting. Sometimes people will put paint into like a plastic bag, like a Ziploc bag, so it doesn't come out and the child can still feel it and it's not messy. But even then, I would really think about the child's experience as their creative outlets are probably going to be elsewhere, not in art media, and their sensorial interest can be accommodated in a lot of ways, whether through water play or playing with nature materials or any of that kind of stuff, or even their food. They're not always going to get their food directly in their mouth, so they're going to have some sensorial experience picking up food. So I would recommend not getting food grade paint for an infant. I would recommend really meeting their sensorial needs of living and getting sensorial experiences, encouraging their creative expression through musical instruments, storytelling, those kinds of things, movement, dance. And then as the child is 12 to 18 months, really allowing for the child to continue to develop that hand. And as they start weaning from the putting everything in their mouth, to be able to then say, okay, this is a great time to now introduce perhaps some art medium. I'll give an example from my personal parenting experience. My first child put her things in her mouth for the longest time. I tried to introduce rock crayons, maybe at like 14, 15 months. No, those were going in her mouth. So retried around 16 months. Nope, still going in her mouth. It probably wasn't until 18 months that I was properly actually able to do some kind of art with my older child. Whereas my younger child, they stopped putting things in their mouth at 12 months. They just did. For whatever reason, everything wasn't going in their mouth after around walking. And so I was able to introduce some art medium pretty close after 1. Whereas my daughter, I had to wait a little bit because she was putting everything in her mouth. And I wanted the association between art medium with what she was doing to not be related to eating and food. We have to remember that the child, especially the child under 3, they are not consciously recalling things. They're putting memories and experience deep, 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 deep down in their brain. And it's going to be that very first connection. If we think about the brain, it's like the first branch. So all the other branches are coming off of that one in that one idea of art or painting or something. And so it's really critical that that first branch not be the wrong connection. Like, we eat art materials. So I would actually not recommend using this. And I would recommend, depending on the age of the child, just using water-based non-toxic art materials as the child is ready for them, potentially after 12 months, potentially after 18 months, and really providing that infant with sensorial experiences that don't necessarily have to do with art medium. Well, That's the end of our Friday Five. The Friday Five is part of our Montessori Masterclass. The Montessori Masterclass is where you can get over 9 hours of self-study lessons, weekly live calls with Montessori trained educators from around the globe, and one-on-one support and coaching to help you reach your child's potential in the most critical years of development. I hope you join us at thepeaceprogram.org/masterclass.